The first section to examine is verses 1 through 12. Feel free to take a moment to pause the video and read this section for yourself. We will begin by looking at these three highlighted verses, which are extremely important for understanding the purpose of the letter. This is because they represent something called the letter formula. Essentially what happened is in the late 19th century, archaeologists began digging at an ancient garbage dump in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And what they found was thousands of ancient Greek letters from 2,000 years ago. By analyzing these letters, scholars concluded that ancient letters had a very consistent design. Namely, they had a greeting, followed by a prayer, and then followed by what is called a disclosure statement. Or in other words, a statement that discloses the purpose of the letter. Usually these disclosure statements sounded like, "I wish you to know, brothers," or "I urge you therefore, brothers," or "I entreat upon you to go do this thing or this thing." And they found that these statements often anchored the whole content of the letter and explicitly informed the reader of the author's purpose. Now this is all very significant for the letters of Paul, as he often follows this letter format. In fact, this is precisely what we see in Galatians. He opens with a greeting, then a short prayer, and then a disclosure statement. In Galatians, the disclosure statement is found in verse 11. "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel." Or in other words, the purpose of the letter and an anchoring consideration for the reader is that the gospel they received by Paul is not man's gospel. And this sentiment has immediate explanatory power for a chunk of verses in 1 through 12, especially in verse 1, 10, and 12, which all echo this same theme. With this groundwork laid, now we turn our attention to the paragraph that we've passed over. And to really understand this paragraph and how it informs how we should be reading Galatians, we have to first understand that Paul was a master of rhetoric. We know from Acts that Paul was a learned and studied man, and in the ancient world this meant understanding rhetoric. That is, knowing how and being able to argue and persuade. This was the task of people who knew the law in that time. And interestingly, there is a manual of rhetoric which was originally believed to have been written by Cicero that taught people how to argue. No doubt, Paul would have been familiar with this work and works like these, and they give various strategies for how to persuade and talk to your audience. For instance, and feel free to pause the video and read the highlighted sections, this work states that if a speaker or their argument has been discredited by their opponents, one needs to subtly draw the audience back to the speaker's character and authority in order that they could be properly heard. Again, this is just a rhetorical strategy that helps someone be persuasive. Another example that it says is that if your audience has already been persuaded by the person who spoke before you, then you need to start your defense with astonishment. Something like, "I am surprised that you are so easily persuaded by this previous speaker." By doing this, the listener is given a jolt that shocks them into listening, or at least hearing the new speaker's point in case they have made up their mind too quickly. Coming back to Galatians, what's amazing is that these two particular strategies are employed by Paul in this paragraph. First, Paul begins with an exclamation of astonishment. This indicates that he is talking to an audience that has already been convinced by Paul's opponents, and he wants to shock them into listening to his argument. But second, Paul uses the stark words in verses 8 and 9 as a means of setting up the high stakes of discrediting his position. But also he uses them as a means of clarifying that he believes his opponents need to be discredited because of what they say, not him. This becomes more significant in the following sections as Paul will draw the audience into examining his life and character, showing that his position certainly shouldn't be written off, and his opponent's position deserves the discrediting. In general, Paul is just using well-known rhetorical strategies in the ancient world to launch his defense, and they help us get a grasp on why Paul is writing in the manner that he is. Before moving on though, one final thing happens in verse 10. "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." This line indicates that Paul was being accused of delivering a gospel that sought to please men rather than God. Paul clarifies that this can't be what he is doing because after all, in verses 8 and 9, he isn't budging in his position when some oppose him. He isn't behaving in a slippery way that folds at every complaint and objection. This is what someone trying to please man would do. Rather, he acts like the opposite by firmly doubling down on his position. This allows him to ironically ask, "Am I now seeking the approval of man? Or in other words, I just clearly oppose these men. How then can you say I try to please man or am fearful of man? No doubt their criticism is shown to be unfounded. In this way, Paul takes a hard line to show that their objection is false, and to show that his central concern is for what is true and just and good. He only wants to say what God told him to say, and in that way, again, defends his delegitimized character. What's more, and you can weigh this one up for yourself, is that this type of retort could be an example of a common Jewish expression that was used in this day, an expression that's actually often found in the Bible. For instance, many places in the Bible actually ironically show that people often condemn themselves with their own words. Usually this will happen if they accuse someone or defend themselves unjustly. Though this happens all over the Bible, 3 explicit examples of this can be seen in Job, Jesus' words, and in one of Jesus' parables, where a man essentially says, "You have condemned yourself with your own words." In this way, verse 10 could be an example of this type of retort. This is because Paul makes verse 10 into a question, suggesting that he wants the Galatians to realize the irony of their accusation. You think that I seek to please men? Actually, no. Ask yourself the same question, because you condemn yourself with your own words. You, Galatian church, folded to the Judaizers' message because you feared them. You are the ones that fear men. The fact that I don't fold to their message now, but double down on my stance in verses 8 and 9 shows that I don't fear men. Again, this is something to weigh up for yourself, but it would give the letter an application to us about how we arrive at convictions and how we need to be honest in re-examining our own conclusions. Altogether, with the letter formula and the disclosure statement, not only do we have the letter's purpose, but also by understanding the rhetoric, we know that Paul is talking from a discredited position, and that since his audience has already been persuaded, he needs to be slowly reclaiming his character and authority before them, in order to both make up ground in the argument and make them re-examine what they have already concluded. Overall, this opening section, especially with verse 10, really shows that Paul has a heart to live out and communicate the truth of the gospel. He has a heart that wants to please God rather than men. And really, this allows him to engage boldly and mindfully with a group of Christians who are in need of help. And what an amazing challenge for us as we begin to study this letter. Are we people that seek to please men? Or does our heart to please God propel us into using our gifts to help others? Moving on to the second section, take a moment to read verses 13 through 24. This section is a small retelling of Paul's Christian experience, and it continues on in chapters 2, 1 through 10. But by looking closely at the details in chapter 1, we notice 3 things. First, this section continues the rhetorical strategy talked about earlier. When you are discredited by your opponent or by your audience, you need to slowly demonstrate your character again. This is precisely what Paul does in this section. First, in verse 13, he opens up about his former life and character and talks about how encountering Jesus changed him. Verse 24 highlights this character transformation as everyone was praising God on account of him. In this way, the recounting of his experience helps to slowly legitimize his character once again. But more than this, Perelman, in his book The New Rhetoric, which studies ancient rhetorical strategies, argues that if your audience doubts you, you need to tell your story. By telling your story, you will endear your audience to you, and they will soften their hearts and ears towards you. In fact, Aristotle was supposedly a big proponent of this idea, and it certainly fits in this section. Not only does Paul tell his story in order to reclaim his authority and show his good character, but Paul also seeks to tell his story in order to rhetorically deal with a doubtful audience. Certainly, this is seen most explicitly in 13 and 14, where Paul recounts that he used to practice what the Galatians now do. He isn't an outsider or someone who knows nothing about these traditions. Instead, he was a zealous Pharisee, someone who intimately lived inside of the traditions and yet now argues against them. This is again a well-known rhetoric tactic, and no doubt Paul, as a master of rhetoric, tells his story as a means of connecting and endearing himself to his doubtful listeners. Verses 15 and 16 have both of these rhetorical strategies as well. In them, not only is Paul telling his doubtful audience how he changed from a zealot to a Christian, but he also takes a moment to reclaim some of his authority by demonstrating that his message and mission have a divine origin. Significantly too, these verses subtly point out what Paul's argument is. Following Paul's confession that he used to live as a zealot in the pursuit of holiness, Paul writes, "When he who had set me apart," that is, how did I change from a zealot? When did I really become set apart? When he, God, who made me holy, when he set me apart. This happened before I was born, meaning Paul's set-apartness did not come as a result of his observance of the ordinances of the Mosaic Law in the present, but rather was a result of God working out his plan in history and in people. God called me by his grace and revealed to me his Son. These were the means by which I changed from a zealot to a Christian. In this way, these verses subtly hint at Paul's position, which will be explored more thoroughly in the following chapters. Finally, this section offers one more significant point. Specifically, it seems to show us another of the initial objections that Paul's opponents used against him. We already learned from verse 10 that one objection against Paul's message is that it was seeking to please men over God. This was shown to be false. And now in this section, we find from verse 17 that they also seem to have argued that Paul had gotten his message from leaders in Antioch or Jerusalem. And therefore, Paul either misconstrued or improperly relayed the gospel message to the Galatians. Essentially, this would be like saying that Paul was no better than a second-hand source. Another option, although it bogs us in a little bit of detail, is that Paul's opponents rejected his message because it was given to him by these men. This would fit thematically with the opening section as well. In this case, Paul's opponents would have rejected his gospel simply because it had come from men. Regardless, Paul defends the objection that he got the message from leaders by showing that he had met Jesus face to face. And then, in verse 17, did not consult with anyone, nor did he go up to Jerusalem. It was only after 3 years that he saw any of the apostles, thus preserving his first-hand account of the gospel. Verse 20 demonstrates how Paul is correcting the record. I am not lying to you. To say that I got the gospel from others is false. I got it from Jesus himself and did not even see the other leaders for 3 years, and I was still unknown at this time. While this correcting of the record will be continued in chapter 2, these verses indicate that Paul's opponents believed he got the gospel from others. Altogether, this section continues Paul's rhetorical argument. Not only does it help him win back authority and address a doubtful audience, but he also corrects the record against a false objection. On top of all this, Paul also used the opportunity to subtly hint at his position. He was formerly a Pharisee, but only after an encounter with the grace of God and Jesus himself is he changed and truly set apart. Overall, chapter 1 is a beautifully crafted work that sets Paul up to argue with the church that he loves. With his writing, he not only puts himself in a position to be heard and understood well, but he is very honest about the mistake this church has made. They have put themselves in direct opposition to Jesus' message. Despite this, Paul's intentionality and heart shines through in the letter. Even among the difficult word that he speaks, this letter still gives inspiration and encouragement to us. For those of you who don't know, our team here feels that while YouTube has a bunch of really great Christian channels, we are actually still missing a collaborative space to deeply study the Bible, a space that explores verse by verse, section by section, the intricate and sometimes confusing minds of the Bible authors. And so we figured we could attempt to build that community. So we are glad you are joining us, and please leave a comment below about something you noticed in the passage. After all, this is the whole point of these videos, to see the body of Christ wrestling with Scripture together.